Hi, I'm Dr. Lachos, and I'm going to show you how to have fun with SPSS by computing the correlation coefficient. To compute the correlation coefficient, we'll need two variables. Each variable must be measured at the ratio level. That is, it needs to take on any value from 0 to 100. You can't do a correlation coefficient, specifically a Pearson product moment correlation coefficient, with more than two variables, and you can't do it with variables that are measured at the nominal or ordinal level. You'll remember that the first thing we need to do is state the researchers and null hypothesis. So what we're going to hypothesize is that in the population, the correlation coefficient is not 0. This is the Greek symbol rho, which is the population correlation coefficient. We can estimate what the correlation coefficient is in the population with the sample correlation coefficient, which is noted as R. So what we're saying is that in the population, the relationship between these two variables is not 0. That is, the correlation coefficient in the population is not 0. Well, if it's not 0, that means there must be a relationship or a correlation between the two. Of course, the null hypothesis is going to say that there's no relationship whatsoever between the two variables. That is, the correlation coefficient in the population is 0. That is, there's no relationship. The second step is to compute the Pearson correlation coefficient, and we can easily do this in SPSS. You can see in this SPSS data file I have a number of variables, but what I want to do is see what the relationship or the correlation is between the number of beers a person has consumed in the last 30 days and their grade point average. So you can see I have 25 subjects here, and I want to see what is the correlation between the number of beers one consumes and their grade point average. This is fairly easy to do in SPSS. We can choose Analyze, go down to Correlate, and choose Bivariate. That'll bring up the Bivariate Correlations dialog box. We can choose the two variables that we want to compute the correlation coefficient for. I'm going to choose the number of beers consumed and move that over, and GPA and move that over. Notice you can only do a correlation coefficient with two variables. Then I'll click on OK, and it will produce that correlation coefficients box in the SPSS output viewer. It'll do every iteration of all of the correlation coefficients. You can see here this is just the correlation between the number of beers drank and the number of beers drank, and we would see that obviously it's a perfect correlation because they're the exact same scores. But what we do want to look at is the correlation between the number of beers drank and GPA, and you can see the Pearson correlation coefficient is a negative 0.61. That is, we can see that there is a pretty strong correlation coefficient, a negative correlation between drinking beer and the number drinking beer and their GPA. We can also see that statistically significant because the exact probability value is 0.001, and we can see that the number in our sample is 25. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and write down our correlation coefficient, which is a negative 0.61. We can see that it is in fact a pretty strong negative correlation. That is, as the scores go up on beer drinking, they go down on GPA. So as the number of beers people drink goes up, their GPA tends to go down. We can see that there are 25 people in our study, and we can see that the exact probability that the effect is due to random variation is definitely less than 0.05. It's 0.001. We can plot that on our decision graph here, where we can see that 0.001 would go right here, and we look up and it says reject the null hypothesis. This tells us that in fact there is a correlation coefficient in the population. It's not 0, and we estimate it to be a negative 0.61. The last thing we need to do is write up our results, and again we can get the sample language for writing up our results in the Cronk text under the section on correlation, association, and prediction. Specifically the section on the Pearson correlation coefficient. Well, I hope you've learned a lot with fun with SPSS, and as always, if you have any questions, please come see me during my office hours.